This is Reimagining Higher Education, your go-to podcast with remarkable education leaders sharing personal stories from their experience in and around the sector, including reflection and hope for progress in the sector. With your host, Professor Judyth Sachs, former PVC Learning and Teaching at the University of Sydney, Deputy Vice-Chancellor and Provost at Macquarie University, and Special Advisor in Higher Education at KPMG, and now Chief Academic Officer at Studiosity. Welcome.
I'd like to introduce everybody to Professor Duncan Maskell, the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Melbourne. I'm going to do something a little bit different this morning, Duncan. What do you want to tell people about yourself and your career?
Okay. Starting when? How did
you get to be where you are? And did you expect to get to where you are when you were, say, 19?
So I was born in Barnet in North London in 1961, which was a great year for Bordeaux claret red wine, by the way. So it's a good birth year. But anyway, my dad was a plumber. My mum worked, originally she worked as what was called a audio typist. But then she had to take time off to have children, because in those days that's what happened. Then she eventually went back to work worked in a factory. So we came from pretty humble background in a way. I wouldn't say we were terribly poor like a lot of people, but we were not well off. Mm-hmm. But my mum and dad and my family had a very strong belief that you should make the most of yourself, and also that the way to do that was largely initially at least through education and hard work. So those values were instilled in me from a very early age. In a supportive environment, incidentally. It wasn't whipping you to get on, but it was just saying, if you want to make something of yourself, and we think you should, here's the way to do it. So I took education, pretty seriously, but I also took having fun pretty seriously. And I eventually, after, at the age of 18, got into university, and I was first in family to go to university. And I went to the University of Cambridge. Which was incredible, and I mean, in those days, going to university at all was a minority activity. We didn't have the sort of massification of higher education that we have now, and getting into Cambridge was really, very a rare event. So I was incredibly lucky and pleased about that. Went to Cambridge, took about 2 terms. We have 3 terms there rather than 2 semesters as we have here. And I took about 2 terms getting used to the idea that I was there. One of my tutors took me aside and said, "You know what? I think you're a pretty smart guy, but you're going to fail at this place unless you do some work." So that brought me up short. I did start to knuckle down and got more out of the place actually by doing that. But so I had a fantastic time there. It taught me so many different things. At the age of 19, I was in my second year at Cambridge. I had a bit of a moment, you might say, during that year where I convinced myself I was going to fail my exams at the end of the year, and I don't know what you'd call it these days, but I guess these days I would have gone to the support services and said I've got a mental health problem. Mm-hmm. But in those days that didn't really pertain, so I had to deal with that myself. Got through it, and then entered my final year, 3rd year in Cambridge as an undergrad, and had a fantastic year. Fantastic, because for the first time we were doing a research project, and that really clicked with me. I really enjoyed that. So I stayed on and did a PhD. So I spent a further 3 years in Cambridge doing a PhD, a very special PhD because it was in a scheme that was running in those days with industry. So I was doing a full-on basic science Cambridge PhD, but also working for a period of time with the Wellcome Research Laboratories in South London, which was great to get the exposure to both sides of the game in a sense. And I guess that instilled in me from day one. There are some colleagues, a few colleagues, who are a little bit snobbish about industry. I have to say, really foolish, because there are so many really smart people in industry. They're just doing a different aspect of what we're all trying to achieve with our studies, trying to find out about the universe, but also then trying to make that work in terms of improving society. And that's a real touchstone for me in terms of why we do this job. Yeah, I retained my lucky streak and got a couple of good jobs. Eventually wound up as a lecturer in Imperial College in London, and then went to Cambridge. I was 35 years old as a professor. I was the youngest professor in the place at the time. And then I sort of jokingly say then an embryo came along and got a professor in mathematics, and that sort of became the youngest professor in the place. But and I stayed there for 22 years, and then the offer to apply for the job here at University of Melbourne came up, and I grasped the chance with both hands, with great enthusiasm, and I luckily got the job, to be appointed to the job. And it's fantastic to be in Australia. It's fantastic to be at this amazing university, and I'm very pleased and proud to have done the job.
Now, you and I share something in common. We both barrack for Carlton.
Excellent. Well, the weekend was a lot better than the previous 2 weekends. Sadly, I was at the games for the previous 2 weekends, and couldn't make it to the West Coast. But no, it's great. Footy is great. I used to. People don't believe me, but I used to watch footy back in England, but when I was a kid.
Right.
Because all things Australian were much more prominent in England back in those days. We hadn't ruined the relationship by joining the EU, so footy used to be on the telly for half-hour sort of highlights thing. And so I've always loved the game, actually, and to come here and see the game live has been an absolute joy. Absolutely fantastic. In fact, I've got a sharing on my shelf up there.
So look, I invited you to bring an object that represented your approach to learning and your experience. So I'm really looking forward to your revealing it to me and to the audience that will be watching this. So what did you bring?
I brought this thing.
It's something else we have in common. I used to play the clarinet.
Is that right? Okay. That's my B-flat clarinet, and I've had this clarinet since I was probably about 13 years old. Right. It's been all over the world with me. It was such an important part of my teenage years growing up. I got grade 8 when I was about 16 or something, and my music teacher wanted me to go to music college and become a musician. And coming from the kind of background I came from, my mum and dad quite wisely said, no, that's far too risky. Go and be a lab technician. You'll have a job for life. Turned out slightly different from that, but so I didn't go and become a musician. But in Cambridge, one of the first things that I did, again, pure serendipity, I saw an advert for an audition for a jazz band that was being formed. So I went along and got into the band, and that started. So I played in a Dixieland jazz band with the clarinet, and then that was we had great fun with that. And playing semi-pro, we were paid. And then eventually we went off to the Edinburgh Festival with a show, and we formed the pit orchestra for a show. The show was absolutely terrible, but the band were pretty good, and we got a gig in the Fringe Club in Edinburgh. It's 81 or 82 or something, and we brought that band back to Cambridge, and we formed a big band. So I've also got a saxophone. I haven't got it here, but I used to play tenor sax and clarinet in a big band, doing Basie and Ellington and that sort of stuff. So it's been a fundamental part of my life. I then when I went to Oxford, I as a postdoc, I also played my saxophone in a rock band there. I had hair down here and a big leather jacket, so times changed. But music's been a fundamental part of my life forever, and playing music for a long time was really important to me as a release, as an intellectual exercise as well, actually. And just really important, I think, to have that balance. I mean, I know I've watched one or two of the other interviews you've done, and most of the people you talk to say that the balance is important, and I really do believe that's really true. You get so I hate it when I'm labelled as a scientist or or an administrator, which is even worse. I hate that. Yeah, still an academic. I'm still publishing papers. Yeah. But being an academic and all those things enable you to think freely and to do lots of things. You don't just have to be a scientist. In fact, most scientists I know are fundamentally creatives. to dream up new hypotheses, to dream up ways of testing those hypotheses is it's a creative act. And so therefore many scientists I know, in fact many of them are musicians. Those who aren't are very much into the arts in different, other different ways, as am I. So yeah, it's an important part of life.
So in terms of
I'll
performance,
put it down now, otherwise I'll start.
being a musician, it's about performance, it's about creativity, but it's also about having passion for your craft, for want of a better word. So have you been able to transfer that and translate those sort of values and those ideas into your leadership and into your role as a teacher in a university and as a learner?
I hope so. I'm aware of it.
Mm-hmm.
I also think it's being a musician, certainly being a sort of trying to be a good enough musician to play out professionally or semi-professionally is a lot about discipline.
Yes.
So the only way you can play freely in a jazz band is if you're disciplined enough to learn the basics. I often say to people, learn all of your scales and all of your arpeggios, and then you can improvise. If you don't have that basic technique, then you're going to be not very good. And so I think that transfers also into what we do. There's got to be a. I'm a great believer in trying to do things to the best possible level you can, to do things rigorously, to challenge oneself to be intellectually rigorous whenever you're faced with a situation. And the other thing I think is really important is that it's not bad to try your hand at stuff, but if you're asked to, back in the UK when the BSE crisis was on, I work in food poisoning and stuff like that, nasty bugs. I was asked to comment on BSE, and I said, no, I'm not going to do so. That's not my strict field. People who comment on stuff when they don't know much about it, especially publicly, I think are dangerous. Mm-hmm. And I think we need to be really pretty rigorous about that as well. Actually, I think we as academics and intellectuals have a responsibility to comment on stuff that we know about. And if we start to comment on stuff we think we don't know so much about, we should be honest about that and say up front, you've asked me for a commentary on this. I'll tell you what I think, but I'm not an expert, Whereas I think in COVID, for example, just to quote one obvious example, we had a lot of people who, well-meaning people, but who were asked for commentary who maybe didn't know much about this subject. And I think that's pretty dangerous. So
you talked about your experience at Cambridge and the sort of the different cultural mores that you came to university with, and the expectations of your peers, and you had one particular tutor that really gave you a come to Jesus talk. Can you tell us a little bit more about your experience at Cambridge? You also said that you had a good time.
Yeah, I mean, I've always, life is for the living, as far as I'm concerned. I think we have a responsibility and duty to society to do what we can in terms of, if I've got particular talents in certain areas that I can run this university, then I should do it, if you see what I mean. But it doesn't mean that I shouldn't also enjoy my life. Mm-hmm. And I think that does bring an important balance into the equation. And I believe that should be the case for all the people who work here as well. I think that's incredibly important. So when I was in Cambridge, I did work hard. I worked hard enough to get my degree, but I also did play a lot of music. I drank a lot of beer, I have to confess. I played a lot of soccer, played a lot of tennis in the summer. You wouldn't believe it to look at me now, but I used to be reasonably fit. In fact, I learned, I got my referee's badge for soccer as well. So I eventually was the secretary of the Referees Association in the colleges in Cambridge. I ran all the referees for all of the inter-college football matches. I refereed the cup final, inter-college cup final, a couple of times, which was a highlight. But I mean, basically what I'm saying is that I did have a broad range of interests, mm-hmm. Good friends, and I made the most of the place, actually. And I hope that young people still can. What I worry about, actually, especially in our system here, is that too many of our young people, when they've got their spare time, are out working to make the money to be able to survive while they're doing their degree. And I think that becomes a attenuated and a denuded experience of university.
So when you think about your postgraduate work as well, I mean, what were some of those key moments of your professional formation and your formation as a scholar?
So I was very lucky in my PhD in that I was supervised by, he was called Carlos Ormeeche. He was Uruguayan, and he'd been in England since the mid-70s when he was kicked out of Uruguay by the dictators. So he and his wife, Raquel, were both in the lab. Carlos worked on typhoid fever and Raquel worked on gonorrhea. And I actually wanted to work with Raquel, but I got Carlos as my supervisor. And those two people taught me an enormous amount about the world that I in my rather sheltered upbringing in North London, had never even thought about. You know, they told me horror stories about friends of theirs who'd been incarcerated in holes in the ground for a year and that sort of stuff. And, you know, Raquel had almost been shot by the military for various reasons. You know, I mean, this is real life. This helped me enormously. But what they brought to it was they taught me about rigor. They taught me about knowing the literature, not just having read the summary of a paper, but actually knowing the literature and being able to quote the literature of the things I was doing. They taught me about being scrupulously honest and rigorous in terms of the science that we were doing. Somebody else in the department, I was in the Department of Pathology in Cambridge, very famous immunologist called Alan Munro. He stopped me in the corridor once and asked me a question. He said something like, "Do you know how salmonella infects cells?" And I said, "Well, I think." And he stopped me there and then. I said, No. I didn't ask you what you thought. I asked you, do you know? And that was very formative, and it stuck with me forever. You know, you kind of know something or you don't.
Yeah.
If it's your field, you better know it. So this is part of the rigorous and, you know, intellectually honest thing that I'm very keen on promulgating. You know, let's cut the BS and let's actually deal with what we know and be rigorous about it. So all of that was formative for me. But also there was a great camaraderie in the lab, and so having brought up in that mode, I struggle with things like workload models and this sort of stuff because, you know, I went into the lab on Boxing Day to clean out mice cages from one of the experiments I was doing, for example, you know, but also there was give and take, and we didn't have to write it down and record it. So if I was out refereeing a football match on a Wednesday afternoon, that was fine, you know, and there was just a sort of a trust and an understanding of what we were about in those terms. I know times change. I'm not saying that's the right way to do things or anything like that. It's just that was something that I liked. I liked that way of working, and I sort of didn't get too fussed about the fact that I was probably working far too long in hours. It just wasn't like that in those days, you know. So it's a combination of understanding how to live your life. It's a combination of understanding there are bigger things out there in the universe that you've got to worry about and think about, and also a real. It's not so much a training, but it's an education in the business of what knowledge is, in a sense, what you know, what you don't know, how to get there, how to interrogate data properly, how to be rigorously honest with yourself about all of those things. So I think I try to bring all of that into my job even now. Yeah.
You came from the UK to what is Australia's premier university. What were your first observations about leading a complex, large, elite university like Melbourne University, and what do you think the big challenges are for Melbourne University, but the sector, for the next 3 to 5 years?
So my previous job, immediately before this job, was being number 2 in charge in Cambridge. So I had some experience of leadership of a very big and very complicated organisation already, although I wasn't in the top job, and that is a different experience. Everyone knows that, but it's really true. Anything that really got too difficult, I could try and kick up to the Vice Chancellor in Cambridge, although he was very adept at kicking it back down to me and telling me to get on with it. But you know what I'm saying. I think people outside the system really, they sort of know that it's a big and complex organization, but they don't really know just how big and how complex this organization is. It's really complicated. And it's made even more complicated by our obligation, and it's an obligation I'm very supportive of, to support academic freedom and freedom of expression. Other organizations that I've dealt with, companies, you know, if you want to criticize the company, you can, but you better resign first. You know, universities are exactly the opposite of that, and good. You know, I'm happy about that, but it's it makes life even more challenging. You know, you might be trying to do something really important and really good, to sort something out in the university, and somebody suddenly pops up over there and says something which is counter that, and that can sometimes put a big spanner in the works, and you know, that can be quite frustrating. But that, you know, that doesn't happen that often, and you just got to deal with it, and it's part of the joy of doing the job in some respects. So I think people in vice chancellor seats have that mindset. You know, I think the interesting, there've been you know, there's a whole range of different things about how universities operate in Australia, which is somewhat different from in the UK, obviously. I mean, one of the big differences, of course, is that we are largely a commuter university. So a lot of the kids live in Melbourne with their parents. That's pretty different to UK. Some, of course, there's some students do that, but even in Cambridge, having lived and brought up kids in Cambridge, their friends, one or two of them went to Cambridge, but they still went to the university. They didn't stay at home with mum, you know, and that's an interesting issue for me, because I think part of the formation of a young person's mind is at the age of 18 or something like that, leaving home, going somewhere else, learning to cope with that sort of thing, with support, of course, but you know, that's part of the education. It's not just all about downloading the information and that sort of stuff. So that's a big difference. I think also related to that, the fact that there's an expectation really that a lot of students are going to stay in their local area is kind of a bit of a shame, really. I'd love it if a lot of Melburnian kids went off somewhere else, and we could get a lot of kids from around the country to come here. I think that would be great for the Federation, actually. You know, and then we get a lot of kids from all over the country, but it's not as much as it could be. I think I'm going to say something radical, I guess, now, which nobody agrees with me about. But I'm going to say it. I would love it if we could get to a system where the young people, for the young people themselves, education was free. There are countries in the world that do that, big countries, Germany. In some,
I was educated for nothing.
Sorry?
When I did my degrees.
Oh, me too. I mean, this is why I feel so passionate about it, actually. I would not have gone to university in 1979 from my family background if I'd have had to have taken out a loan. You know, and I would contend that although times have changed somewhat in terms of credit, I would contend that a lot of the more disadvantaged kids are probably coming from the same position, frankly. And it's just an accounting exercise for the government in a sense. The money is the same. It's still going to spend the money, and they'll get the money back at the end of the day. Because actually, you know what? I've paid for I had a free education, except I've paid for it many times over, because I've been successful. I get taxed at a high rate. All of that tax has paid for my education millions of times over. So, you know, it's a bit of a, I don't know, smoke and mirrors in some sense about that. So I would just love it if we could do that. I know that the current minister is very clearly passionate about access, as am I. And I do think that the best way to improve access is to remove financial burden, or at least one of the big elements of that. So yeah, that's one thing that I really think is interesting. I'm also there's a sort of, I don't know what the word is exactly, but there is I really don't like bureaucracy. A vice chancellor saying that, oh my word. But I don't like bureaucracy, and I don't like managerialism. And I do think that we do have a little bit too much of it in the universities here, in places, maybe a lot of it in some places, I don't know.
Is that because of regulatory frameworks and?
Yeah, I think we're over-regulated. I mean, the amount of compliance we have to do is extraordinary. We just had a little quick and dirty report on it the other day in the university here, and I can't remember what it was now, but it was 100 and something pieces of legislation that we have to comply with. Yeah, this is crazy. And it's all about, there's a very low risk attitude. I think that could be true in the country more generally. I don't know, but you know, and we start to do lots and lots and lots of extra checks and balances just to remove that final 0.5% of risk. And actually the curve is like this, you know, you've got rid of all of this risk with just a few instruments, and now you're trying to play around with this asymptotic part of the curve, and it's just pointless. It's a great deal of effort for not much return, or almost no return. I mean, if we could sort that out, and certainly within my institution, you know, we need to be working on that. I think that would help enormously.
What expectations do you have of the Mary O'Kane report when it finally comes out?
So that's an interesting framing of that question. My expectation for that is quite high, because I think Mary and the people on the committee are really good. Mm. And so I think I'm expecting them to come up with something really good. Exactly what that is, I won't really know, but there is quite a consistency coming through in different submissions about certain certain areas.
So what in particular would you like to? I mean, the Group of 8 has a particular approach. The various other sort of university groups have different expectations as well. When you think broadly of Australia higher education, what do you think is important that comes out of that?
First of all, the University of Melbourne is a very willing and enthusiastic member of the Group of 8, but the Group of 8 does not talk for the University of Melbourne in all cases. Right?
Yeah,
So,
I spent 12 years at the University of Sydney.
You know, and I'm not meaning to be disparaging at all there, but it's just it's an important distinction. So the first place to start is, I do think that we need to integrate the higher education system across the piece. I was astonished when I first got here and realised that there was the state controlling TAFEs and VET, the federal government. In fact, the university is regulated by an act of parliament that is a state act of parliament, and yet it's funded and regulated by the federal government. Yeah. This is always going to be a recipe for not disaster exactly, but less than perfect efficiency, I would say. If we could find a way to willingly stitch all that together, I think that would be terrific. I think that would then open up a lot of opportunities for understanding that there are a lot of people who can benefit from a skills training, but also an education. And I make a distinction between those two things. Mm-hmm. Take my dad, for example. He was an incredibly smart bloke. He went and became an apprentice plumber because he didn't get into the local grammar school, as it was then in the UK, because his family couldn't afford the school uniform, right? But he was smart enough. He would have been brilliant if he could have done his skills training on the tools, as in his apprenticeship, and then had a few units at the University of Melbourne learning about business, let's say, or something. I don't know, even something really different, and have a couple of sessions where he could learn about music or the arts, even, you know, making rounded people, letting people explore their full potential. I think that's what we should be doing. So if we can stitch that together, I think that'd be a really great thing. I also think that we need to sort out the financing models for the universities, and that's on two fronts. Number one, I really have been staunch in saying from day one we need to get rid of job-ready graduates. We mustn't fiddle at the edges with it. It's poor legislation. It doesn't achieve its objectives, and in fact, it devalues some of the most important areas that we need desperately. I'm talking about the social sciences and the arts. One of the things I've been pushing hard, we've just had a big initiative on climate change. There will be technological answers to elements of climate change and that kind of thing. The social sciences of all descriptions are just as important in effecting a solution to our climate challenge. How do we help politicians get the policy runway they need to effect these changes? What are the ethics and the law around a lot of these things? Et cetera, et cetera. All of those things which come into it. So we need to get a funding system that's fit for purpose in terms of the educational side of things. And something I'm really strong about is, and I've been saying since I got here again, is the full economic costing of research. We need to have a unified, clear-cut, simple system for costing up what it costs us to do research. The idea that the costs of research are the direct costs, and then somehow there's this magical stuff that goes on in the back office which just supports it in some kind of way, I think is really, it's not good accounting, let alone for anything else. So if we got a model where we understood the full economic cost of research properly, governments could then make choices about whether to spend 100% of it in their granting schemes, or whether to tell us we're only going to give you 80%. You've got to find the other 20%, or whatever, you know. But some kind of deeper clarity around that issue, I think, is really important. If we did 100% of FEC, that would also, of course, then remove the incentives that not incentives, the requirements on us to go out and seek other sources of income simply to fill the gap. And this is where we go and get a lot of international students and everything else. International students, incidentally, are fantastic, really important. But the driver to, one of the drivers being to fill a financial hole is not great. I'd much rather that we went and got loads of fantastic international students because of the benefits they bring to us and we give to them and to the world, in fact, in terms of educating the world. So that full economic cost of research, I think, is incredibly important. I think we've got to be very much clearer, much clearer in our commitment to disadvantaged students, but also, and I don't mean to talk about Indigenous people in terms of just disadvantage at all, but we have to have a clear plan for getting many more Indigenous students through higher education. Of course, there are loads of really smart kids out there who happen to be Indigenous, and we don't get the right proportion of those kids coming through the universities. So we have to be proactive and quite clear-minded about how we do that. And I think that's an important element of how the Accord process might pan out. There's a whole bunch of other stuff, but they're the main things for me.
I've got two more questions because I'm aware of the time commitment that you've promised. One is, you mentioned about students being commuter students and not having that sort of residential experience. If there was one thing, and that students are also having to work probably as much as they study, in fact, sometimes they work more than they study, what can we do to sort of enhance the student experience so that they get that sort of formative, transformative experience that they carry with them for the rest of their lives?
That's a big question, and I mean, we've just launched our Advancing Students an Education strategy, which rolls up student experience as well into that. Student experience is about stuff outside the classroom, but it's also about what happens in the classroom too, and how that integrates. One of the first things that I did when I got here was set up a Deputy Vice Chancellor role for student experience. We've stopped doing that now, actually, because we've rolled it up into a different framing with our new provost. She's been here nearly 2 years now, but also, I mean, of course, in Melbourne, the student experience took a bit of a hit during the lockdown period, reflected in the quilt scores, and everything else. So we got some stuff to rebuild there, actually. But I think we have to be. I can't give you some off-pat answers to that, but what I can say is we need to. The new strategy that we wrote. Advancing Melbourne, which we launched just before COVID, great timing. But one of the real big messages in there is that students are at the heart of everything we do. And I think we might have lost focus on that a little bit in this university and in some other research intensive universities. University is not a university without its students. It's a research institute.
Yeah.
So if we want to retain the title university, we need to take that very seriously. And I know all my colleagues here and in other universities understand that and are working hard to do that. So now, if we frame our existence here as having students at the heart of what we do, we start thinking harder about how we include students, how we provide services for students. We listen harder to them when they say, look, this service really isn't working. Rather than saying, yes, we're hearing that, we're going to make a tweak here and there. We say, no, we're going to change it up, to a better quality in general. So it's things like that matter. I mean, at the beginning of COVID, we dug a big hole in the ground and we knocked down a few buildings ready to build our new student precinct. And there was a big decision to be made where I was getting advice that we should put a concrete cap on the hole in the ground because we didn't know what the finances were going to do. And I said, no, we're not. We're going to build it. And we did. We spent $210 million actually building our new student precinct. It was great because we built it during COVID when there weren't any students around. And then we just opened it a few months ago. It's fantastic. It's a great area for students to occupy. It's really nice combination of modern new buildings with some of the old buildings that have been refurbished. And you know, all the feedback we're getting is that it's really working out well. And it's that kind of, I believe it's that kind of focus on students. In other words, I wasn't going to say no. I was going to say we've got to build this during COVID. That's what we have to spend our money on, actually. That's what we have to spend our money on. You know, student-centered and student-focused stuff. And we have to do that whilst not throwing the baby out with the bathwater and keeping our very, very high research reputation. That's a real challenge. But we've got to do both if we want to be a really good and proper university. And I really believe that very strongly. I believe very strongly in the axis between research and teaching as well. Those two things go together. It's not an axis. It's not a dumbbell with one on either end. They're actually one thing. And they're just different aspects of that landscape. But we've got to keep bringing that together whenever we can. And I think the more we do that, the better the experience the student has. They feel rather than having a sort of mundane lecture, they might be being taught in a much more creative way with you know, research-driven sort of ways of teaching, et cetera, et cetera. So you know, all of those things come together in the student experience. Plus, you know, providing facilities and providing opportunities for them to express themselves in their societies and their clubs and all those kinds of things. Obviously, that's very important. I mean, there are other things too. Student welfare is incredibly important for making student experience good. During the COVID period, again, we spent a lot of dollars, lots of tens of millions of dollars actually, on trying to help the students who are here, especially our overseas students who are staying on shore, survive that period. And we're still doing, you know, free food handouts and that sort of stuff right now. So, you know, all of those things come into it as well.
So what advice would you give to aspiring student leaders as they sort of leave university and progress into, you know, the social, corporate, intellectual world, whatever?
I think the most important thing, actually, and I hope that they learn it at university and take it with them, is the freedom to think and express ideas. I think that's incredibly important. Never be told that you can't think that. Right? Never ever accept that. And you know, push back. Do it politely and reasonably. I think that's another thing that I think is being lost a little. You know, the idea that the only way to push back is in a aggressive kind of black or white kind of way. I'm a pretty black and white person, incidentally, but you know, it's you've got to learn actually how to be respectful. You might not respect somebody's position on something, that's fine. But you know, when I'm talking to you about it, I'm not going to be rude and offhand and unpleasant with it. You know, you're a human being, and I'm going to be respectful. So there's a big thing there for me that's very important that I hope many of our students learn. Also, you know, I was a teenager in London when the punk movement was going around, and that I had lots of mates who were punks. I never did the green hair thing myself, I'm glad to say, but you know, disruption is important. I think sometimes I surprise some of my colleagues because one of my fundamental properties is that I'm a disruptor, really. Probably not a great thing for a vice chancellor to admit, but you know, I do believe in some sense in constant revolution. Does that make me a Trotskyist? I don't know, but the idea that we should be challenging knowledge all the time is fundamental to what a university should be about. If we challenge the knowledge in a rigorous, intellectually valid way, and the knowledge still stands up, that increases the strength of that knowledge base. You know, so I am now utterly convinced that the Earth is not flat, right? Because I've tested that knowledge in lots of different ways, and it still stands up to all those tests. Having said that, you know, Newtonian physicists at the turn of late 1800s would have said Newtonian physics explains the universe. Einstein came along and said, no, mate, you're wrong. You know, so even things like that can be challenged, and sometimes big changes happen when those things are challenged. You've got to challenge it in an intellectually rigorous way, and you've got to do it in a respectfully minded way. Otherwise, you're just shouting the odds, and that's no good. They're the things I would hope that people can take away from universities.
And my last question is, what advice would you give to the younger Duncan?
As a younger person, be slightly less aggressive and argumentative. don't get too worried about stuff. I used to be a bit of a worrier in my younger days, and I've learned over the years. I suppose the only way I'd say I've become wiser is that I don't worry about stuff much anymore. Most of the terrible things that could happen are either going to happen or they're not. If they don't, what are you worrying about it for? If they do, you've got to come up with a solution. I mean, COVID came along. It was a really stressful time, but I didn't really worry unduly because I was confident in my capabilities and the capabilities of my team, and the vast majority of people in the university here, of course, as well, to overcome it. And we did. So good.
Duncan, thank you for a most enjoyable and enlightening 40 minutes this morning. And I hope that we cross paths again at the Universities Australia Vice-Chancellor's dinner.
Or even something more exciting than that.
You mean football?
Yeah, maybe. Thanks very much for inviting me, Judyth.
Visit studiosity.com/Students First for the next Students First Symposium, an open forum for faculty, staff and academics to candidly discuss and progress the issues that matter most in higher education.